Greetings, everyone. This is a critique of the first project. I just kind of went through and pulled off some of the better photographs, or sometimes just where I think I had something to say about the photograph. And so we'll look at this as a critique. I'm going to try and mix up the critiques as we go through the semester a little bit. I'll probably do a couple of these group critiques. I do want at some point want to give each of you a more in-depth individual critique of the works that you post. So I'll do that probably later in the class. Um, but with this one, I just wanted to give you some of my thoughts on some of the images that I saw. So with this first one, it becomes kind of an interesting question. Why do I pick a blurry photograph? Because I don't think every photograph has to be sharp and perfect technically to be interesting, though it is good to be able to master your tools and to understand that, and that's part of what these first couple projects are about, is trying to understand aperture and shutter speed and how they affect the image and how we can utilize them, not only technically but also expressively. I find this image, at one point I'm like, why is it all blurry? And the other point I see is like, it kind of intrigues me. It's an interesting perspective. It's from fairly low. Pretty much I think everything is fuzzy and a little bit blurry, but there is as we look, like this is fuzzier here, and then as we move back progressively, things get sharper, so the focus was back here, but I don't think anything is perfectly in focus. So it kind of illustrates a little bit what aperture does and how the camera sees where things that are out of focus get progressively more out of focus. So I don't know if this is a great image, but it does intrigue me. I want to start with these two images. We have this image, which I really love the composition of these. They're essentially the same or very similar photographs. I like the composition of this one a little bit more, where I don't have this house on the left-hand side. But the other thing I really want to talk about here is this, I think, really illustrates exposure, that idea of how much light hits your CCD or your film in your camera, and how it affects how an image looks and how it expresses ideas. Because I look at these two, and this is, I think, a exposure that is good, technically well, and we're exposing for the figure, the person. And it's photographed fairly well. Are exposed fairly well. I really love this composition. I like the face, I like the circle, the handlebars, I like the contrast of the sky. I love the negative space of the sky, or the trees. I love the trees. They border this image. I think it's a really well composed photograph, and the exposure on the figure, I think, is just slightly underexposed, which I think is actually good. But we see the sky is somewhat overexposed, but I also think that is good. It's not completely overexposed. There is some what we refer to as density in the sky. It's not white, white, white. There is a little bit of density in the sky. So I think this, to me, is a nice exposure. Now, if we go to the other one, this is also a proper exposed image, but not for the individual. This is properly exposed for the trees and the sky. And this is something we have to think about. The camera has a much more limited range of values it can see than we and humans can experience. This is one of the ways photographs abstract things. The camera does not have nearly the value range, the ability to capture the value range that our eyes can see and our brains can process. So if we look out, if I look out my office window here right next to me, I can see detail in the bricks and the windows and pictures I have in here, but I can also see detail in the sky and the cars and trees outside. And there's a huge amount of light differential between something interior and exterior, no matter how many lights you have on inside. And these two photographs function the same way. This is exposed well for the sky, the previous one's exposed more for the person, and a lot of times in the camera we have to make these decisions, and that can greatly affect and alter how people see and perceive the photograph and what they think. This one I'm much more concerned on the individual and the relationship to the bike, and then the rest of it's kind of background. When I look at this one, I'm not so caught up in the individual. They're more of a abstract human person with an abstract bike, and then I see all these details in the trees and in the sky. And I think overall the emphasis is still on the human, but I'm much less caught up in identity in this photograph. So it really can change what we see and what we think about in a photograph. I really like this image. It seems kind of loose in structure and style, and I don't have any problem with that. And I think it actually kind of works. I think I made a comment on Flickr how I love how he just flows in this whole photograph. Like the whole photograph just flows well and is very harmonious. And it even includes the shirt. You know, the shirt, the warm yellow green of this shirt just flows in with the warm yellow green of the leaves. There's so many leaves and trees in this image, and the tree house and the houses are neutral, and the the wood deck and the treehouse are natural colors, and then his hair and the beard is natural, and the shirt is a very natural color. Just think of this photograph if he puts on a red shirt and how that's going to alter the photograph and alter how we see it and alter how we think about his relationship with the environment. Right in here he just flows. I think if you put something like a red or an orange shirt, it's really going to stand out and separate him from that environment. So I love how everything flows. Even the hair flows so nicely. It's so organic and curly, and all those leaves. Everything in here just seems harmonious and flowing. And I really like that portrait. Though the one thing, I don't know if he's slightly out of focus. Might be one slight problem. So, all right. I like this one. Thinking of this one, I like the photograph, and I like looking at the picture and that content and connotation. And it seems like memory or reflection as I look at this image. I even like what I really like technically about this image is how aperture is affecting it and allowing us to focus on the hand in the photograph. We have a lot of somewhat like most of our houses. My house, anyways. There's a lot of stuff going on in it. We have a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of visual clutter in the background. But it doesn't harm the image because the narrow depth of field keeps the sharpness on the photograph and the hand. And everything else is softer and blurrier, and therefore it pushes it back and allows us to focus on the thing that the photographer wants us to focus on. So I think this is a very good example of aperture and a thoughtful use of aperture helping create a good photograph. Because I think if you photograph where everything's in focus, where this is in focus, and the background's in focus, it's going to be a very different photograph, and it's going to be visually overwhelming. I kind of like this one too. It's there's the textures and the values are so different. We have this extreme light, dark. We have very soft, very sharp. Nice textures, very smooth textures. There's a lot of contrast in this image, and it's divided right in half. It almost looks like two separate photographs put next to each other, but I'm pretty sure it's just one image. But so I like the push and the pull of this image, and I can see how some people might not like it. I'm not sure what all the comments were on it, but I could see criticism of this, like, well, it's half and half, and we should, we typically try and avoid half and halves in photographs because it stagnates it. But I think it actually works in this image. So, again, if we shift that focus, I think if we actually focused on the figures in the background, and this was out of focus, I would be really I wouldn't like the image. I don't think it would draw me in, because then this stuff here on the right would seem pointless, and it would seem just kind of intruding into my experience of the photograph. But I think the emphasis overall is still here, but it creates a much more balanced emphasis. This would serve no purpose out of focus visually, because all the interesting stuff's here. But since this is sharp, it helps balance and draw my attention to it. Whereas we as humans, anthropocentric. We think humans are very important things. So typically there's a human in a photograph. We go there and we think that's kind of the subject almost always. And this kind of flattens that interest out. So I kind of like that unexpectedness of that. This image, I really like the light and the texture and the contrasts. I love the texture that comes across in this shirt. I love the light. There's this nice side lighting, and there's good values held here. And we have a little bit of detail here, but it's fairly dark. And we have contrasting of these horizontal lines in the wood, and the shirt, and a little bit of the skin. And I just think overall it's a pretty engaging photograph. We don't get identity, and that kind of can sometimes add sort of a mysterious nature to photographs of people, because we're so good at looking at faces and reading them. That's one of those human skills that we have, is the ability to read faces. So when we are presented with a face, we can get so much information out of there. We can look at a person and determine fairly quickly trustworthy or untrustworthy. And of all the species on this planet, we are one of the best at that. So that's based on science. I'm not just making that one up. All right. I like this image too. I just like the glasses, the gaze of the eyes, the hair, and I really like the balance of the negative space and all these things. I think it works out pretty well. The brush, to me, I don't know if that's necessary or if it really impacts me in a positive or negative way. I think it adds a little bit of content. Sometimes it distracts me a little bit because I just love the composition of the face and the gaze and the glasses and the hair and the negative space all works out so well. The brush to me seems kind of intrusive sometimes, but I can also see how it adds, some content and some meaning for the photographer, for the person photographed. So I thought this was a interesting photograph. Like when I see it small, it really piques my interest because it almost looks like a bloodied hand. Because I can't see the details. It has a super hand form, but then the colors are a little bit off. And I'm like, it could be a glove, or it could be a hand, or it could be, I don't know what's going on in there. So, and that becomes interesting because so often, how we experience photographs, the context in which we experience a photograph can really change or alter how we react to it. And so when we see them on a screen, it's different than seeing them in person, or if we see it on a billboard or whatever that context is, that can really affect and alter our perception of photograph. So when I see this one small, I can't make out all these details, and it makes me want to get closer and see it bigger. And then when I do see it bigger, I then obviously realize what it is, but I'm still engaged with the photograph. I still find it interesting. I still like the lights. I like the dark. I love how this thumb here is hanging up here. It seems unsettling a little bit, and I like that tension of that image. And I really like the narrow depth of field. And again, I think if everything's here sharp, this photograph's not be nearly as interesting. That narrow depth of field adds a sort of mysteriousness to it, and kind of adds more questions to it. I think that's a positive thing. Most of us are, portraits we're focusing, or we're doing, well, anyways. I really like the space in this image, and I like the light. There's a lot going on in the photograph. It seems like a very quiet moment, and it also seems like a very nice job with exposure and balancing outside and inside. That can be tough sometimes for a camera, depending on the lighting situation. But there's such a nice light. I love the natural light in the photograph, and there's I like this diagonal line. We have this shade here, and then we create this other line that goes back this way, and we also have these shades here. Then we have the figure in there playing the guitar, and then we have the complementary colors with the green wall and the reddish sort of curtains here. And there's just a lot of movement in here. There's a lot of movement, but also seems to have like a nice soft mood to the image, and it seems to be an interesting, just everyday sort of moment. Um, but I think it works out really well. I enjoy this photograph. We have two here that I want to look at. We have this one and this one. And the talking about facial expressions previous, looking at the facial expression here, there is, it's a very intriguing expression. That's what grabs my attention when I look at this image. And the other thing that I see is the very low perspective. Like the camera's on the ground. It feels like she's peering at me while I'm lying on the ground when I look at this photograph. So that adds a kind of an interesting tension to it. But I also like the shapes that we get, like the negative shape of the arm here, how they get shaped. So we have like this pseudo rectangle, vertical rectangle, and then we have the figure here, and then we have this big rectangle in the foreground, and everything's kind of bluish colored, kind of unifies it. But really, it's the facial expression here. That gaze right at the camera is, when I look at the photograph, that gaze is coming right at me, and it makes me feel a little uncomfortable. But it also adds an interest, and I'm like, what is this person looking at? Sort of idea, I also included this one. Here again, everything's very soft and out of focus, and I'm just curious when I look at images like this. I'm like, well, what could be in focus, or what should be in focus? And we're trained to have something in focus all the time, and 99.99999% of our photographs, something should be in focus and sharp. And here I talked about two of them today, so that's blowing my whole percentage out of the water. But the softness, the out of focus, the grayscale, the gaze, again, it adds this sort of mysterious quality. Because since the face isn't sharp, I can't see all of the tiny details in the face to get a sense of really what that gaze is. It seems a little creepy though. So, but it's funny. We have two very different photographs, and I get a very different feel and different information from them. The compositions are very similar, but they're photographed and presented in very different ways. I really like this image. I love the really wide-angle lens, and I love that really close focus. We get how the camera sees. We have the aperture where we have a narrow depth of field. So a large aperture, which is a small number, 2.84 or something like that, is a large aperture, and it creates a narrower depth of field. So that is one way the camera is seen. The other way that we're being affected by how the camera sees is this wide-angle lens. Our eyes don't distort perspective like this. We lie on the floor and look at someone's foot this close. Their body is not going to get that small that quickly. And that's one way that a wide-angle lens can distort what we're seeing. So, but I also really like, I just like the composition of this, that monumental foot coming forward and then leading back to the figure here. And the colors in the dress matching sort of with the wood. And, I think it's just a well-done photograph. Here's another playful one where we're playing with the camera, like the camera becomes a viewer. And images like this, like you become hyper aware of the camera and of this idea of the gaze. And the gaze is, if we look at contemporary philosophy, something I often talk about in some of my art classes. I research like the design principles. We have all our design principles. And a lot of those, I think, are from a very modernist perspective. So I've done some research on postmodern design principles, and they'll bring up the gaze. And the gaze is the idea that you are aware of the looking and the seeing process in art or in photography or in culture in general. And this one seems like they're coming at me with this paintbrush or something like that. So I really like that narrow depth of field. I like the composition. I like the interaction with the camera and what it makes me think about. I like this photograph quite a bit too. The one thing I think is there's just minor things like, well, I don't know. Okay, the exposure for one, I think, is exposed for the screen. I think that's good, but we do get a little overexposure out here, and I think we need to balance that out somehow. I don't know if that's something that could be done in the camera, as we talked about earlier, how the camera has a narrow range of ability to see values, but we might be able to do it post-processing or something like that to find that balance, or maybe even just or even just exposure, letting this go a little teeny bit darker and just trying to get a little bit more information here. Kind of nitpicky technical details. Also, I might want to square, or I think I'd like to square up the screen. It's just at a slight angle. I think I want to rotate it and just square it up a little bit. Yeah, and I have a pet peeve of horizons that are off. So being a landscape photographer, I often notice that and comment on. Though sometimes that can actually work, like the off kilter angle can work. I'm not sure if it's working for me in this image, but maybe it's working for you. Here I like the simple things. We have nice soft light, just the sink and all the textures and the rag, and then of course there's the hand holding the silverware, and the nice surprise, of course, is in the spoon. We have a reflection of the individual holding it. So that's a really kind of a subtle thing in this image, which I think helps keep people's attention. And that becomes one of the issues in photography, is there are so many photographs in this world, so many good photographs in this world. How do you get people to look at yours and think about yours and spend more time? And really in photography, you've got to push the envelope. You've got to do the unexpected. You've got to really know how to manipulate all the camera's functions and how it sees to gather people's attention. It's a sort of double-edged sword. Photography is so pervasive. The cameras are so pervasive. They're everywhere, that people can participate in this medium, and in some ways it devalues it because there's so many photographs. Everyone's a photographer. But at the same time, it also pushes up the game of photography, where you have to be more innovative, or you have to be smarter, or more conceptual, or you have to be more something, it seems, to really push yourself over the edge into success in a medium that is participating. But I love the democracy. I love that so many people can be creative and participate in this creative process. I think it's a very nice thing about the photographic medium. Here I kind of like I love the cans, and I love the paint, and the peeking up I think is kind of interesting, but it's so dead center. I think that's my main issue with this photograph is this is so, his face is so dead center in the image, it kind of distracts me a little bit, and I'm not as engaged with the photograph because I just see him. But there's a lot of interesting stuff going around him. And I think if we pushed him around somewhere in that frame, got lower or higher or something with the camera, got him out of the center, I think we'd have a more successful and interesting photograph. I really love the textures in this one. I love the hidden figure, out of focus person here, and I love all this variety of textures and the diagonal lines. It's one of those images that is possibly like the horizon that's not perfect, but it doesn't matter. I don't have any grounding that disturbs me in that manner. I just really love all the lines and the textures and the contrast and the contrast of objects and the human. I think that works out well. I really like the composition of this photograph. I love the play, with the shoulder in the foreground and the mirror back here, and I even like this figure in the mirror. We have all these rectangles, rectangle, rectangle, rectangle. We have all this nice compositional play. The only problem I have is like nothing is really sharp. I want to sharpen it up because I want probably back here this area in focus and sharp. I'm gonna guess the camera probably moved or used a slow shutter speed. Could actually go on the flicker and see that maybe. But I really like the composition of it, and I like the structure of the image. I like this one too. This is, photographs we usually think of, being photographic and look real. When I look at this image, it seems like a collage. And I really enjoy this sort of awkward angle and the awkward angles of all these objects. And then there's feet, and there's this contrast of textures of the human, and concrete, and dirt, and flowers, and different focal lengths. Like this is somewhat out of focus, but the feet are in focus. And I find a really dynamic, engaging photograph. But the photograph, it feels like a collage. I think that's a good thing. You need a lot of variety. This is another one that feels like a collage. There is just so much going on in this image. There are so many angles. The horizon's obviously off, but I could care less because I completely feel ungrounded looking at this image. Because there are just layers of stuff and reflections and seeing behind things and out of focus things, and it's a lot to take in. But that amount of visual information is what keeps me engaged. There's enough organization and recognizable things here that it keeps me engaged and keeps me looking and keeps me guessing and keeps me asking myself, what is going on in this image? Even the use of depth of field, face is slightly out of focus, but this is sharp, but that's sharp, but this is out of focus, and blah, blah, blah. It's like a hall of mirrors or something like that. I like how the crayons lead up to it. I might crop this off a little bit here. That's kind of distracting a little bit. I might even actually crop the photograph just below this line here, because I think that adds a little more attention. I don't like the negative space above the figure, though I like the use of the depth of field. You have a narrow depth of field out of focus to in focus. So, all right. Well, I believe I selected a photograph from everyone, I think. So if I didn't include a photograph from you, please let me know, and I'll be sure to do that. But there are some thoughts on some of the things I saw in this first project. Go forward. Let's get going with the next one. Get your images posted up on Flickr, and we can start having a little dialogue before they do, and get some input from me and from your classmates, and we'll try and make more great photographs.